Can I just say one thing firstly? I love the name Eat, Sleep, Boxing, Repeat.
Welcome back to another big fight breakdown on ESBR Boxing's YouTube channel. This is a video about the big rematch taking place on November the 15th between Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn. They do it again after that thrilling fight back in April at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. Danny Elliott called the big boys in for this one, but very much needed. Looking forward to throwing a few opinions around and seeing what happens. Just so you all know, watching this video, we are doing this in two parts. This is video one. If you're watching this video, video two may not be out yet, but please do look out for it on our YouTube channel and subscribe to us if you haven't done so already. Elliot, how much was size a factor in that first fight? We had a 160-pound weight limit. Eubank just missed weight the day before. Conor Benn, I think he came in, was at 4 pounds under the weight limit, naturally a welterweight Conor Benn. Eubank, as we know, won the fight on a close-ish point decision on the night. How much was size a factor in that fight, do you think?
For me, I think that I think you touched on it there. The size factor for me actually kind of came before the actual fight, in the sense of Eubank having to boil himself down and being somewhat depleted, obviously on fight night with the right rehydration clause and all that stuff that was kind of going on. I think that obviously affected the performance from Eubank. You know, I mean, obviously early on he looked like quite weathered, and the fact that he obviously showed a lot of tenacity to dig in and actually make the end, obviously win the fight. But you look at how he was hospitalised after it as well, and all the sort of talk about how unhealthy it might have been to sort of make that weight. I think it actually kind of had more of an impact on the sort of sloppiness of the fight. To be perfectly honest with you, I don't think it was necessarily a high quality fight, frankly. Though we saw Eubank really dig in, showed a lot of grit actually to get through that. I think during the fight itself, I mean, yeah, obviously there was a sort of size difference, but I think it was in so many ways kind of as it was intended, kind of negated somewhat by the fact that Eubank was obviously drained. Equally, I don't think Conor Benn looked that great at the weight either. Obviously carrying the extra pounds from where we were expecting to see him. So maybe from that perspective, it did influence the fight, but I think it, rather than influence it in one man's favour or another man's favour, it kind of just made the whole thing kind of quite sloppy for me. I'm interested to get Danny's thoughts actually on it, because on the actual performance aspect. But for me, it just seemed like the actual impact was really before the fight took place rather than during.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, because I think you've got one guy who shouldn't be at middleweight because he's a welterweight, and you've got one guy who maybe shouldn't be at middleweight because he's really a super middleweight. So you could argue both fighters are in the wrong weight division. Are you of the opinion that Eubank really shouldn't be fighting at 160 anymore, Elite? He's campaigned at 168 before. He's been at 160 a long time. He's not a young fighter anymore, 35, 36 years old now. Are you of the opinion that he really shouldn't be at that weight anymore?
I think so. I think looking at the effort, I mean, obviously, it was quite well documented actually, the weight cut on socials and the things he was sort of going through to even make that weight. And I think, yeah, I think the fact that, like you say, he's getting older, the fact that he's been through it, the fact that he went through that cut before, around the sort of KFC time, obviously when the fight was sort of cancelled as well. So he's obviously been through a couple of those cuts as well now. And you feel like, for me, I just think doing that successively and the age you are as well is going to take its toll. So I personally would rather not necessarily see him fight there. But like you say, he is also. He was almost an odd one. He was almost like quite small at super middleweight as well, but kind of too big for middleweight really for me. So it's kind of in that, if there was a sort of weight class around 164, he'd be suited to it perfectly. But it just seems like, for me, I think I'd rather see him maybe just campaign outside of 160, or maybe have a couple of pounds extra. But I wouldn't like to see him kind of continually keep going through these cuts, and the hospitalisation, like I said, after the fight last time
Yeah.
on precautionary grounds, or whether to rehydrate, etc., would probably testify that he probably shouldn't be doing it as well.
Yeah, hospitalization alone perhaps should mean they kind of probably shouldn't be doing that again, but here we are. Danny, give us your thoughts on, yeah, generally just how much was size a factor in there, like in terms of when it came down to the night when Eubank was able to rehydrate up to 170 pounds, how much of an impact did that make on the actual result?
Well, I've been told many times in my life, lads, that size isn't a factor. However, I didn't believe it then, and it's definitely not applicable here. I think the size, particularly in the second half of the fight, was why Eubank was able to win the fight. When all boxing sort of nous went out the window and it did turn into a slugfest, it was Eubank's size that really got him over the line. But it is sort of counterbalanced by the point Elliot Grigg made, that he was so depleted to have the size advantage he was with the weight cut and the rehydration, that he was a shadow of himself. Certainly the performances we've seen against the likes of Liam Smith in the rematch, and going before that, Liam Williams and such. I think it does act as a good equaliser, because Conor Benn's probably physically at his absolute best. Certainly, he's not having to go through the strain that Eubank is with the cut and the rehydration clause. You'd imagine isn't affecting him anywhere near as much, but he is a naturally much smaller man, so they do sort of even each other out, or they did on that night. I'm not sure which way the scale is going to tip because that cut and that rehydration clause and that fight will have taken a lot out of Eubank. But to say the five wasn't a factor is craziness. It was the whole reason the fight was made because I think they thought that the size advantage to Eubank would be counterbalanced enough by the how depleted he was, and it did prove to be the case. Although I'm not sure it would be the case the second time around.
Yeah, and I can't help but think that another 7 months on, it's going to be that more difficult for Eubank to make the weight. So we'll see. Look, I mean, look, he just marginally missed the weight last time. Just kind of got something wrong. I think it was the weight of a battery, something like that. He missed weight by. So we could be in a position where he makes weight this time. Just going to throw something out there. I wouldn't be surprised if he comes in exactly 1 pound overweight, so pays potentially the same fine he did last time. But then is more comfortable coming in a pound heavier than he did back in April. But we'll see what happens. Little way to go yet. Danny, how much demand do you think there is for this rematch? The fight's back at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, so another 70,000 tickets available. There have been murmurings on kind of social media within the industry, and some people saying there's not that much hype for the rematch. But what's your opinion? How much demand is there for this fight, do you think?
I don't think it's a rematch we necessarily needed to see. I think the buzz around the first one, the build up from the egg slap to the drama with Senior on the night was never going to be replicated. It's not even come close to being replicated. Like, I really don't feel like there's too much buzz around this at all. Now we are still 3 weeks out, and that can potentially increase as we get closer to fight night. But I think when you factor in, you mentioned earlier about Eubank being in the hospital for 3 days after the rigmarole there was about getting this fight on in the first place, dating all the way back to the failed drugs test. I just get the feeling this should have been a one and done. I think they almost got away with one with how depleted Eubank was, and to push through it again with the same weight and rehydration clause. And the first press conference, okay, it was sort of in the wake of Ricky Hatton's passing, which is obviously going to have a factor, but it did feel a lot flatter than certainly the launch press conference for the first fight. And I don't think there's been huge demand for the rematch. I said after the first fight, I want to see Eubank, if he is to carry on, go up to 168, which I think would be a much better weight for him, and some interesting fights for him where, okay, he'll maybe be an underdog in a lot of them, but at least he'll be physically not as hampered as he would be at 160. And then Benn, I think he's rolling the dice too, because it's another 12-round war at middleweight. What's going to be left of him? Can he get down to welterweight again, where he's got much better aspirations of winning a world title? Even 154, big ask for him. The name's there. So I always said after the first fight, I'd like to see both men go in different directions. But money talks. It's no surprise at the rematch here. But, is it one, like you take, for example, Carter Froch, George Groves one, the demand was that rematch had to happen. This doesn't feel like that at all.
No, I think in the first fight, look, let's not forget it was an entertaining fight. As Elliot said, wasn't the best quality-wise, but it was an entertaining fight. Just not necessarily of a very high level. But I just think that first fight, you had the egg slap at one of the launch press conferences. You had a packed football stadium. You had Chris Eubank Sr. making that dramatic entrance. It's going to be hard to top that, and as you said, Danny, that press conference a few weeks ago, the launch event for this event, it just wasn't. We've had Chris Eubank Jr. trying to not allow Eddie Hearn to speak. We've had the face-offs, and there's been quite a lot of it, as well as the stuff that happened when this fight was supposed to happen. These Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn, actually, they've spent a fair amount of time together now. So we'll see. We'll see what happens on fight week and see if there's another egg slap or something like that. Elliot, your demand for this fight's going up. Obviously, you infamously listened to the first fight on the radio. For this fight, you're upgrading it and watching it. You're coming to mind, we're watching it together. So really looking forward to that. But what's your thought? Is in the circles that you operate in, has demand gone up for this fight, or has it gone down?
Thank you very much for that. I think Well, no, as you know, myself and Fabio Wardley, we're both casuals, as has been declared. So in a way, I'd be interested to kind of get the kind of casual audience. But I am interested actually in the kind of true casual test of this. I don't think there's a great deal of appetite in it in these circles, the high flying circles that I do operate in. But I think I actually would pick on some of the things that Danny was saying as well. I think Danny is very right in that this won't live up to the first fight. There was almost a kind of like WWE demand to the first one. You know, you had like Eubank Senior stepping out that taxi, the egg, all these different sort of gimmicks that really sort of took it to the next level. And they've obviously been kind of done now. It's kind of hard to kind of reach that height. And I think there's a kind of for me, I mean, don't get me wrong, it's not as bad as like the Jake Paul matchups, or the Misfits matchups. But there is a kind of when you have these kind of gimmicks and these kind of like, oh, one person severely weight drained, all this kind of like, these sort of mitigating factors. For me, it does bring that kind of like event entertainment rather than serious boxing fight into it. Even though boxing is a serious sport and someone could physically get hurt, it feels like it's massaged by this kind of promo kind of events world. And I think what Danny said actually in the earlier question about Benn being at his best, but still coming up short and still arguably being disappointing in that fight, actually for me probably hampers this fight as well because you've kind of seen, like you say, a prime Conor Benn against someone who's sort of severely impaired and still not really been good enough to get that victory. And so for me, I think that is also why I think people in boxing look at it going, doesn't really need to see it again. Like we don't need to see this again. And that kind of filters out, I think, to everyone else. I mean, the casual audience probably will enjoy it as from an event spectacle, but I'm not sure about paying for it. And obviously your generosity knows no limits. I'll be at your house, obviously, and we'll enjoy that. But I just wonder if you're one of the true casual sort of fans, whether you actually bother to pay for this, to be honest with you, whether you'll just kind of wait for a YouTube clip on a couple, or wait for it to hit social media or do that rather than actually bother to buy the event. So I'm interested to see actually how it does perform. I don't think the demand really is as there as we are told, led to believe that it may be there.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of factors here. The price of the pay-per-view has gone up from 20 to 25 pounds. That could be enough to put some people off. There's another pay-per-view card, so November 22nd, which is arguably the card of the year. So you might have some hardcore fans who say, actually, I won't watch Chris Eubank, Conor Benn live. If I can only afford one, I'm going to pick the November 22nd cards. But on the other hand, look, when it comes to casual fans, 70,000 people went to watch Tyson Fury face Derek Chisora for a third time in December 3 years ago when it was freezing cold. And that just made me think, don't underestimate kind of the power of those casual fans. They will, if there's a big name involved, they will buy a ticket come rain or shine. So it's one of those for this fight. I feel like the casuals will still lap it up and love it, but the hardcores maybe not as much. Danny, going back to you, how past his best is Chris Eubank Jr.? 36 years old now. This will be fight number 39 for him. Made his debut back in 2011, so he's been a pro for 14 years now. I'll give my own opinion, but are we looking at someone who's still got a lot to give? Are we looking at someone who's pretty much finished? Obviously, the weight comes into that as well, but what's your opinion?
I'm not going to, excuse me, sit here and call him finished, but I think it's closer to that than the first thing you said. I think we've not seen the best of Eubank since the DeGale days, really, the days up at 168 when he had that much more aggressive front foot combination punching style. I think ever since he linked up with Roy Jones and attempted to become a bit of a Roy Jones, go on the back foot and pot shot and leap in with these hooks, I think he's looked a worse fighter for it now. That might have been something that was physically necessitated. His body maybe couldn't do what it used to do when he was in his 20s. But I think as well as that stylistic, I think decline, I think we are starting to see physical decline. I think that when he was taken out by Liam Smith, all right, there was questions about how he'd done the weight, but that took something out of him. He looked very fragile that night. And I thought even though he showed a lot mentally and he showed a lot of grit to grind out that fight with Conor Benn, he did look buzzed a couple of times, and he's always been, renowned for his chin, taking punches off big men. George Groves, of course, a very big punching super middleweight, couldn't really put too much of a dent in him. And, Conor Benn had him on staggered legs a couple of times. So I think he's well on the back nine. Eubank, I said after the first fight, he's made a lot of money. I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to seeing him retire and call it a day. Someone who definitely doesn't need the box. And as we keep going over the conditions for this fight, I do worry for him, but I think you'd maybe see a slightly more robust, stronger, more durable version of him up at 168, but it's such a tough division. It's difficult to see him having too much success up there either. But at 160, I think, yeah, it's close to the end for him, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's kind of factors here in terms of what version of Chris Eubank Jr. would you get at 168 versus 160. But Elliot, what's your opinion? Like, are we looking at someone who's really kind of on their last legs, or not so much for you?
Yeah, it's a shame you didn't come to me first, really, because I'm going to say some things which overlap with Danny. Now it's going to look like I'm horribly copying Danny when I did have some of these independent thoughts myself. But I think, yeah, the Eubank, obviously they're hooked up around Roy Jones, changed him stylistically, but I think he also lost a bit around that sort of Nick Blackwell era when he really had Nick Blackwell, frankly. And I think we didn't necessarily see the same kind of spite that he used to have in his younger days after that fight either. I think, like you said, you look at it, 38 fights, 36 years old, some really sort of draining weight cuts in those as well. And like, yeah, the Liam Smith fight off the back of one of those draining weight cuts, obviously, as well. And I think I agree with Danny. I don't think he's finished. I think he could have another couple more fights, possibly at super middleweight. I wouldn't disparage him or criticize him if he walked away. I just kind of feel like with Eubank, he was almost kind of probably better actually in some ways than like the CV and that people look back on him. I think in some ways that he could have probably gone a little bit further, possibly, if things would have worked out a bit different. So in a way, seeing him in this kind of fight, for me, whilst a big event is not the sort of marquee sort of opponent I'd like to see him possibly in with, but I do think he's on the decline. But I do think he could have maybe one, maybe two at super middleweight if he wanted to. If there were big, like, sort of Riddier card events against sort of marquee names in that division, possibly, I think he could definitely, sell an event like that as well. So I actually think past his best, maybe one or two left, not finished, not McKendry finished as well, I don't think.
No calls to retire just yet. However, before we finish part one, this big fight breakdown, I will just say sometimes you see fighters give one last great performance. And I can't help but think that might have been Chris Eubank Jr. against Conor Benn in April. It just looked like, especially towards the end of that fight, it looked like he didn't have much left at all. And I think kind of the question is he done completely, or is he just done at 160? I think maybe that's the wider question here. But I just wonder sometimes, yeah, as I said, fighters have that one big fight left, and that might have been Chris Eubank's fight against Conor Benn. But we'll see. We'll see. Please do join us for part two of this video. It will be out shortly after this one. It may be out already by the time you're watching this video. Danny, Elliot, thank you both very much for joining me. I'll speak to you again soon.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, mate.